The sign appeared before words were spoken. An unknown traveler arrived at the doorway of a Pythagorean, offering no name, no parchment of identity. What he offered instead was a figure, 5 straight lines drawn in a single continuous motion, returning to the point where they began. The Brotherhood recognized it, and he was received. The subject here is not the philosopher, nor the theorem. It is a mark drawn on a surface, shared between people who needed to know whether they were among their own, and in passing also carried a word they used as a greeting: "May you be whole." The evidence for this comes from Iamblichus of Chalcis, a 4th century Neoplatonist whose Vita Pythagorica remains the most detailed ancient account of the Brotherhood's inner life. In the 33rd chapter, he records the pentalpha as the Pythagorean sign of recognition, the symbol by which members of the school identified one another. The Brotherhood inscribed a letter on each of the 5 points: upsilon, gamma, iota, theta, and alpha. Read in sequence, they spell Hygieia. The theta substitutes for the diphthong ei, accommodating 6 sounds onto 5 points without distorting the word. Today, a physician would most likely define health as an absence of illness. Hygieia, to the Greek, carried a larger meaning. To them, it meant wholeness, a life whose parts are in correct proportion. The word was personified in the goddess Hygieia, daughter of Asclepius, the god of medicine and healing. To the Romans, she was called salus, a blessing, a state of flourishing. Our modern word hygiene descends from the same root, though its meaning has narrowed. The word was not only inscribed on the figure, it was spoken. The Pythagoreans use Hygieia as a greeting, setting it at the head of their letters and exchanging it between members of the Brotherhood, a password and a benediction in the same breath. To say it was to identify yourself. To receive it was to be wished well by someone who meant the word in its full depth. The sign and the greeting were one instrument. When a Pythagorean drew the 5-pointed figure or passed it to another, he declared membership in a school devoted to the study of number and form, and extended to whoever received it a wish for wholeness. Are you one of us? May you be whole. 1 mark, 2 meanings. This is the note on which the story begins, not a decoration, not an ornament, not a symbol whose meaning was arbitrary. A figure chosen because its geometry justified the weight placed on it, and because the blessing it carried was large enough to survive 2,000 years of transmission. How the geometry earned its weight is the next question. The answer begins with a circle and a compass, and it proceeds by demonstration rather than assertion. A diameter is drawn straight through the center. A perpendicular bisector cuts it at 90 degrees, dividing the circle into 4 equal quadrants. 1 point governs everything to follow. M, the midpoint of the radius, halfway between the center and the circumference. Let the half radius, the distance from the center O to the midpoint M, be the unit 1. The full radius from the center O to the top of the circle T is then 2. From M, a straight line is drawn to T. 2 legs of a right triangle are now visible. The horizontal leg OM, length 1, and the vertical leg OT, length 2. Here the Pythagorean theorem enters the construction directly. It states in any right triangle, the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides. Since 1 squared plus 2 squared equals 5, the line MT extending from the midpoint of the radius to the top of the circle, has a length of the square root of 5. This distance is then transferred with the compass along the diameter from M to a new point, P. The distance from P to T becomes the side length of the regular pentagon. Set to that span, the compass steps 5 times around the circumference, marking 5 equally spaced points. Connecting those points with 5 straight lines completes the regular pentagon. The pentagon is complete, but the figure the Brotherhood carried was not the pentagon itself. It was what lives inside it. Connect each vertex to the 2 vertices it does not share a side with. 5 straight lines cross the interior. The pentalpha appears, drawn in one continuous motion, returning to its starting point. Now look at what those crossing lines produce. Each diagonal is divided into 3 segments by the 2 others. Measure the long span from the vertex to the first crossing. Measure the short span, the interior segment, between the first and second crossing. Divide the long span by the short span. The result is 1.618, a number so specific it could only be a coincidence if it appeared once. It appears at every crossing of every diagonal, 5 times in the same figure, without variation. This is phi, the golden ratio. Its precise value is 1 plus the square root of 5 divided by 2. The square root of 5, produced by the Pythagorean theorem in the construction just completed, is still here, now visible in the ratio the diagonals cut into one another. The theorem built the pentagon. The pentagon contains the ratio. The ratio contains the theorem. The 3 are not separate discoveries pointing at one another from a distance. They are the same relationship seen from 3 different angles. A brotherhood devoted to the study of number and form would not have missed this. The figure was not arbitrary. It was chosen because it could be proven. The brotherhood did not impose this proportion on the figure. They found it there. The golden ratio is not an interpretation of the pentalpha. It is a property of it, as certain and as impersonal as the theorem used to build the pentagon. It lives inside. The golden ratio does not appear once and stop. Draw the 5 diagonals and the crossings produce a smaller regular pentagon at the center of the star, its vertices defined by the same intersections. Connect those vertices and a smaller pentalpha appears inside the first. Inside that pentalpha sits a still smaller pentagon. Inside that pentagon, a still smaller pentalpha. The figure opens inward without end. At every stage, the ratio between the outer pentalpha and the inner is phi. The proportion does not change as the figure shrinks. It recurs at every scale, self-similar, inexhaustible. There is no smallest pentalpha. There is no point at which the construction closes and the figure stops giving. This is what the Brotherhood placed their word for wholeness on. Not a figure chosen arbitrarily and assigned a meaning by convention. A figure whose interior is without remainder, whose proportion recurs at every scale, and whose geometry could be demonstrated to anyone willing to follow the construction. The sign of health was built from a proportion no whole number can close. Wholeness, in the figure they chose to carry it, turns out to be not a finished state, but an inexhaustible one. They knew this. It is why they chose this figure and no other. The proportion they found was not theirs alone. It was already embedded in the world around them. Blackberry blossoms unfold in 5 petals. The apple, cut across its core, reveals a 5-pointed star of carpels, each containing its seed. The star fruit, sliced at its equator, shows the same 5-pointed profile. 5-fold symmetry appears throughout nature, governed by the same necessity, constructing a pentagon. This is worth pausing over. The Pythagoreans chose the 5-pointed figure as their sign of wholeness. No botanist inherited this proportion from the Greeks. no blossom was taught the five-pointed shape. The form recurs because it is a stable, generative shape, as geometry and biology confirm. The Brotherhood placed their word for wholeness on a figure nature had already chosen. There is one more property of this figure, and it is the most unsettling. The long span and the short span, the two same lengths whose ratio produced phi, cannot be measured by any common unit. No fraction, however precise, captures their relationship exactly. The ratio between them is phi, and phi is irrational. It cannot be expressed as the ratio of two whole numbers. The long span and the short span are incommensurable, sharing no common measure. This was a discovery, not an assumption. The Pythagoreans built their understanding of number on the conviction that any two lengths could be expressed as a ratio of whole numbers. They saw whole numbers were not merely useful, they were the foundation of order in the cosmos. To find a length that resisted this was not a curiosity, it was a crack in the foundation. The discovery is attributed to Hippasus of Metapontum, a member of the Brotherhood. According to legend, he revealed the secret outside the school and was drowned for it, thrown from a ship, or swallowed by the sea as divine punishment for the disclosure. The legend should be treated as legend. What is not legend is the discovery itself. Incommensurability exists. The ancient sources associate its discovery within the Pythagorean tradition with the pentagon specifically, and it forced a reckoning with the limits of whole number arithmetic the Brotherhood had taken as bedrock. The Brotherhood placed their word for wholeness on the one figure whose own interior no whole number can close. The geometry does not merely support the meaning, it enacts it. A figure without remainder. A word for health understood as a life whose parts are in correct proportion. The three arrive at the same place by different roads. How the geometry earned its weight is no longer a question. The sign did not survive as a living tradition passed from master to initiate. It survived in books where scholars in the Renaissance encountered the Pythagorean pentalpha through patient reading and the reconstruction of something found on the page but no longer practiced. The first clear recovery in the scholarly record comes from Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim, De Occulta Philosophia, published in 1533. Agrippa was a German polymath, physician, and occult philosopher who spent much of his life compiling a comprehensive synthesis of Renaissance magical thought. He knew his ancient sources, and among them he knew the Pythagorean pentalpha. In Book 3, Chapter 21, he presents the figure with the Greek letters read around it, tied explicitly to the Pythagorean tradition through the account of a revelation to the Seleucid king Antiochus, in which a pentagonal figure bearing the word Hygieia appeared as a sign of divine favor. One detail matters here and must not be lost. The figure Agrippa presents in this context, the one explicitly carrying the Hygieia letters and the Pythagorean attribution, is oriented point down. This is distinct from a separate diagram in De Occulta Philosophia, which shows a man inscribed with an upright five-pointed star, illustrating the proportions of the human body and the correspondence between microcosm and macrocosm. That figure is not the Hygieia pentalpha. The two diagrams present different arguments in the same book. Conflating them is a common error in this territory, and it is one the present essay declines to make. What Agrippa recovered was not a living password. It was a reading, the Pythagorean sign of health, reconstructed from ancient sources and placed within a Renaissance synthesis of natural magic and sacred geometry. The sign had been dormant. It was now legible again. A second recovery came from a different kind of scholar. Vincenzo Cartari, an Italian mythographer, published Le Immagini degli Antichi in 1556. In the 1609 edition, he depicted a Pythagorean image, an upright pentalpha lettered with the Greek Hygieia and the Latin salus, captioned Segno della salute, the sign of health. Cartari's image is not a recovered artifact. It is a Renaissance reconstruction, and he names a source. The sign, he writes, also appears in the form of a pentagon on the ancient medals of Antiochus. This source needs its own scrutiny. No surviving Seleucid coin bears a pentagon lettered Hygieia. The claim traces instead to Agrippa, who reports it as a legend, a sign revealed to Antiochus before battle, told in the same breath as the cross shown to Constantine before his. Cartari is not reading a coin, he is reading a story about a coin, already once removed from anything anyone had seen. Cartari's page itself is a plain diagram, a pentagon labeled with letters, nothing more. No ring, no gem, no jewelry, and no coin either, only a legend of one. Later retellings compounded the error. The diagram became a ring, and the ring's source became a verified medal, each generation adding certainty the one before it did not have, the kind of embellishment arising when a story gets retold more often than it gets reopened. What survives is a legend about a legend. Antiochus's sign, as Agrippa told it, then Cartari's page, gathering new confidence at every stage it was never asked to earn. Hygieia found new surfaces to inhabit, real ones, and eventually, in the retelling, several it never had. Agrippa and Cartari were not alone in preserving the Hygieia reading. The scholarly trail through the 17th century encountered the same ancient sources and recorded the same 5 letters. Johann Heinrich Alsted, a German Reformed theologian and encyclopedist, included the Pythagorean pentalpha and its 5-letter inscription in his 1630 encyclopedia, treating it as established fact of ancient Pythagorean practice rather than esoteric curiosity. 3 decades later, Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit polymath, preserved the same reading in his 1665 Arithmologia, a work devoted to the symbolic and sacred properties of number. Neither Alsted nor Kircher was transmitting a living tradition. Both were doing what Agrippa and Cartari had done before them, reading the ancient record, finding the 5 letters, and recording what they found. This is the scholarly trail. It runs from Agrippa in 1533 through Alsted in 1630 and Kircher in 1665, and it carries the Hygieia reading forward intact, available to any subsequent scholar who cared to follow the same sources. The health reading did not die with the ancient brotherhood. It lived in the books of men who read carefully and recorded honestly. The scholarly trail did not run alone. Alongside it, Drawing from the same Renaissance sources, a second road opened, one that carried the pentalpha forward but left Hygieia behind. Eliphas Lévy, a French occultist whose Dogmes et Rituels de la Haute Magie appeared in 1854, placed the pentalpha at the center of his magical system, calling it the sign of the microcosm and the figure of the Word made flesh. He knew the Pythagorean attribution. His own figure captions name Le Pentacle de Pythagore, but his argument never draws from the Pythagorean tradition. It draws from Kabbalah, Gnosticism, and Christian Hermeticism. Hygieia was absent. The health reading, preserved by Agrippa and the Encyclopedists, was submerged beneath a new symbolic framework. From Lévy, the pentalpha passed to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in London around 1888. It became a central instrument of ritual practice, a sign of spiritual polarity, powerful in its own right, but no longer carrying the word for health on its points. This second road is worth knowing. It is not the road this essay follows. The pentalpha it leads to is a real figure with a real history, but it is not Hygieia's figure, and its history is not this one. The essay follows the first road, not because the second is without interest, but because the first is where Hygieia lives. The trail ended at a doorway, not a Pythagorean doorway, but one built in the 18th century on the same conviction. Geometry carries meaning, and meaning can be demonstrated. What was found there is the next question. The doorway belonged to Freemasonry, a fraternity emerging in the early 18th century on a foundation it named explicitly, geometry, and the moral instruction it provides. Anderson's Constitutions of 1723, the earliest formal codification of speculative Masonic principles, established this foundation. In it, James Anderson named the greater Pythagoras as the author of the 47th proposition of Euclid's first book, calling it the foundation of all Masonry, sacred, civil, and military. This is the craft's authentic Pythagorean inheritance, not the pentalpha, not the five-letter greeting, not the brotherhood sign of wholeness. What the craft received from the Pythagorean tradition was the conviction this essay's geometry section has already demonstrated. Geometry is not merely useful, it is meaningful, and a figure's proportions can stand for something beyond the lines themselves. Anderson did not need to know about Hygieia. He knew about the 47th problem. It placed the craft on the same ground the Pythagorean Brotherhood had stood on 2,000 years before. It arrived late on American soil for reasons of its own. Jeremy Cross, an American Freemason, included the five-pointed star among the third-degree emblems in his True Masonic Chart, first published in New Haven in 1819, without written explanation of its significance. It is not mentioned in the ritual or the lecture of the third degree. As the craft's own encyclopedic tradition later confirmed, American Masons adopted it by tacit consent as a symbol of the 5 points of fellowship, the postures of Masonic embrace central to the degree. The choice, whatever Cross intended, was practical rather than historical. 5 points for 5 postures. No document links Cross's five-pointed star to the Pythagorean Brotherhood. No ritual text traces it to Agrippa or Cartari. The star arrived usefully at the right moment for reasons the moment required. One distinction must be made before the argument proceeds. The blazing star is not the five-pointed star. They are distinct symbols with different histories. Albert Gallatin Mackey, the 19th century's most comprehensive Masonic encyclopedist, insisted on the distinction, even as some later Masonic writers have treated them as essentially unified. The present essay follows Mackey. The blazing star appears in the lodge after the earliest monitors, listed in the Grand Lodge Instructions of 1735 as one of the ornaments of a Master Mason's lodge, described as the glory in the center. Its earliest representations carried waving or radiating points with the letter G at the center, standing for God, geometry, or the grand architect of the universe. In modern usage, many representations have replaced the waving pointed star with a clean five-pointed star, a development Mackey himself considered incongruous. Among the oldest symbols of speculative Freemasonry, the blazing star carries no descent from the Pythagorean pentalpha and no trace of the letters of Hygieia. Mackey recorded the kinship with precision. The outlines of the Masonic five-pointed star, he wrote, match those of the pentalpha of Pythagoras, a symbol of health. Read that sentence carefully. Mackey did not claim the craft inherited the pentalpha from Pythagoras, nor did he trace a line of transmission from the ancient brotherhood to Jeremy Cross. He saw the two figures shared the same outlines, and he named what the ancient one meant: recognition, not descent. The observation deserves its full weight, not a secret handed down from master to initiate across 2,000 years, not an unbroken chain of custody running from a Greek doorway to an American lodge floor. The same form arrived by different roads, and a careful scholar recognized its kinship to something older. The pentalpha did not descend from Pythagoras. It was identified as his. This distinction is everything this essay has been working toward. The argument has been made and the record has been consulted. What remains is older than both. The wish the Brotherhood placed on the figure's 5 points, still given, still whole. The sign began as a way to know a brother and to wish him well in the same gesture. One mark, two meanings. The Brotherhood drew it at doorways and set it at the head of their letters, offering the oldest gift, a wish for another person's wholeness. That wish traveled a long road, passing through the geometry of a figure whose interior no whole number can close. It survived in the books of careful readers who recorded honestly. It arrived, unannounced, in the outlines of a star an American Freemason placed among the emblems of the third degree, for reasons unrelated to ancient Greece. A scholar recognized the form as the same one the Brotherhood had carried across the ancient world. The craft did not inherit Hygieia. It encountered the form again on its own ground, by its own road, and a scholar who knew the ancient record looked at what the craft had adopted and named the kinship. Naming that kinship is an act of wholeness, seeing the connection, stating it plainly, and extending the wish forward into a new century. Hygieia, soundness, a life in balance whose parts are in correct proportion. The word the Pythagoreans set at the head of their letters, inscribed on the 5 points of their sign, has arrived in this room. May you be whole.